at least 100,000 people in this country who have a criminal record for possession of cannabis. And as a result of it, if I was to fill in a job application correctly, bar becoming a parent or a politician, I wouldn't get the job. So from the point of view of helping an individual, from the point of view of progressing an individual and for them developing, probably one of the worst things that can happen to them is they get a criminal record for possession of any drug, whether it be cannabis, whether it be cocaine, whether it be heroin, whatever the drug, because from then on, your life is limited. If you want to become a teacher, if you fill in your form correctly, you will not get that job. I've been on the board of management of 2 different schools, national and secondary school, and they wouldn't even get in the door. Even though if you are a practicing alcoholic, you will get in the door. So I think for that reason, for the benefit of over 100,000 people in this country who would be freed by the legalization of cannabis to continue with their lives without having a stigma, which in many places is the equivalent of a stigma of having a criminal record for being a paedophile. So that would be one massive change if cannabis was legalized. One of the other reasons I would support it is that, and Gino has alluded to it, we talk about controlling drugs. We have absolutely zero control over drugs at the moment. None. I heard the Fianna Fáil representative talking about the ambition to reduce supply and to reduce demand. Well, we have been trying to do that since the 1970s. We haven't reduced demand. Demand has gone through the roof. In the 1970s, when you originally tried to reduce supply, you couldn't get cannabis in Castlereagh. 10 minutes. 10 minutes if you didn't know how to get it now, you'd know where to get it. And that includes, I'll put it like this, you can't even keep it out of Castlereagh prison. Now, if you can't keep it out of Castlereagh prison, how are you going to keep it out of open society? And I'll tell you how you know you can't keep it out of Castlereagh prison, because I have been there under protest, and on my first night there, I smoked cannabis. So if the ambition is to stop people using it, well, if you can't stop them using it inside a wall that's 5 meters high that my brother and a few lads in Castlereagh built, and there's no way of getting out, but still they managed to get the drugs in, I think for that reason we need to not only regulate it, but to tax it. And I'd say one of the biggest reasons, I would say, why we should legalize it is that I actually think the only reason why I ever went near any other drug was because any other illicit drug, sorry, don't fall into that trap, was because it was sold out of the same pocket. And I remember many's a night when I was in college where you'd go, we'll have a smoke tonight, lads, and you go off and you'd look for it. And guess what? On many occasions, they didn't have it. But they had a few pills and they had powder, etc. And from that, people started using other drugs. I have to say, I'm not a fan of them. I don't understand why people use them. If I did, grand. But it does lead to a gateway situation. And for that reason, I would legalize it. And you don't have all night, so I'll stop there because I could continue forever. But I think the good news, though, is it's brilliant what you've done. And to come out, like, grand, I say it. I'm Luke Ming Flanagan. I have a certain audience. But someone like yourself, Aidan, it's phenomenally good news. And I think it's brave of you to do it. I don't think it's politically difficult, but it is brave, because if it didn't require bravery, there'd be more people saying it. And I think even listening to James there is an admission that it isn't the most efficient use of Garda resources. So in comparison to when I started talking about this first in 1997, and I'll be honest with you, my main motivation was that I wouldn't be a criminal myself. A lot has changed on this, and we moved a long way on it. And I think that's positive. What I'm doing about it is I had a bill before the Dáil, and I would say the number one thing that I try to do about it is I try to live my life in such a way that I can prove to people that as someone who uses cannabis, I can still lead a healthy lifestyle. I run any day that I can run. and that my mind works correctly and I can work on other areas. So for me, I think possibly the best thing I could do for the legalization of cannabis is maybe to excel in other areas.
Okay, thank you. That was very personal and very powerful, so thanks for that. I'm going to move on to the next question, and we have quite a few, so I hope we can keep it brief. Just to the members of audience that have their hands up, we can leave all of that until the end, so I hope you can keep the question in mind until then. Right. So in a very similar vein is the next question, which is your party in favour of decriminalising other drugs? So leave cannabis out of the equation, other substances. If you and your party are in favour of it, thumbs up. If you're not, then just stay as you are. Okay, perfect. So we're going to start with you, Colm. Could you explain why Fine Gael is not in favour of decriminalising other drugs?
Can I just outline in relation to the Citizens' Assembly, because I want to go back on that, because I actually think it's extremely important. You go back to, say, 2010, and if you said to people we're going to introduce legislation about marriage equality, people would have actually laughed at you. And I think what the Citizens' Assembly did on that whole issue was that it opened up the debate, and it actually gave a huge amount of information out there as a result of that debate being opened up. Likewise, in relation to decriminalisation of any kind of drug, I think that's where the Citizens' Assembly can play a part in having a discussion where there is no political involvement in real terms, and make a presentation of what their findings are to the people in the political arena. And just in relation to change of legislation and about how slow it moves, and I'll give you one simple example which I was involved in, where I produced a draft bill on setting up a structure for dealing with missing persons, where all the evidence is that the person has died. There was no procedure available. You had to wait 7 years, whereas in Scotland there had been a procedure in place for over 40 years where you could apply to court for a presumption of death order. And the legislation on that, the report on that was published by the Law Reform Commission in 2011. Yet 5-6 years later, there was nothing brought forward by the Department of Justice. I published my bill when I was in Shannon. Then when the Dáil was dissolved in 2016, the bill fell by the wayside, and I reintroduced it then again. And eventually we got the Department of Justice on board. But from the time I published the bill day one to actually getting it through, it was over 5 years. So it just shows how slow. And that was something that wasn't going to cost the state any money. It was a simple procedure where someone could apply to court, where all the evidence was that one of their family has gone missing. The remains haven't been found, but there was no process available for them to deal with that person's affairs. So like here we are now talking about a fairly substantial change in law. And I think that's, and I actually think the Citizens' Assembly brought forward the introduction of the marriage equality. I reckon it brought it forward by 10 years. And I can go back to when I was involved, say, when I was actually going to college and studying law, got involved in, say, abolishing the status of illegitimacy. Children born outside of marriage didn't have the same rights to their father's estate as children born within marriage. And I started off that campaign back in the long before any of you were born, right, even before some of our other guests were born, right? I remember we set out that it would take us 10 years to get the law changed. And it actually took us 7. And that was a straightforward piece of legislation as well, where there wasn't equality in the law. And it just goes to show, and it's about carefully planning. Yes, there is a need for change. There's a need to carefully plan for that need. And the question is, how do you then bring the general public on board in trying to affect that change? Thanks.
So, Colm, just to clarify there, in relation to why Fine Gael is not in favour of decriminalising other drugs, is that because the legislation would take so long to bring in? Is that the issue with it, or is it a different issue? just to make sure our audience
I think there's still,
understands.
I mean, you take cannabis. I mean, there is no question about that, and Gino is right on this. I mean, cannabis, the use of cannabis by some people is of benefit for them from a health point of view, and it has taken us quite a bit of time even to get change in that. And in fairness, Gino has done a huge amount of work on that, and I think it's important that we acknowledge that. But there is still a resistance within the political structure and also in the within the community against change in law in this area, but not all of the facts are out there on it, and that's why a recent debate needs to occur, and I think this is the way of dealing with it.
Right. Thank you. Thanks for clearing that up. That was a brilliant answer. So I'm going to move on to James now. You said that Fianna Fáil are not in favour of decriminalising other drugs. So could you explain why they aren't in favour of this?
Yeah, sure. So just the other thing is, in terms of answers as to the debate, I'll try to answer what Fianna Fáil might do, but I'll probably give more favour of what James Lawless thinks, because we are a large party. We have, I suppose, a broad church, and sometimes so we would have members, or we would have representatives who could be conservative, and we would have some that can be liberal. So sometimes a party like that can advance incrementally, and some of us might push harder, and some of us maybe need a bit of persuading. But sometimes that can actually be quite useful because it mirrors society. So if we can have a debate within the party that comes to a certain place, we've already kind of talked through some of the arguments that might come up in the wider public when these issues are introduced. So maybe just to mention that at the outset. So I suppose it's about bringing people with us some of these debates as well. The question about why would we not support decriminalising other drugs? I'm not entirely sure what drugs you mean. Part of the reason I was interested in taking part of this is, I suppose, to learn and listen to what other people's views are. As I understand it, other drugs would be things like amphetamines, speed, MDMA, cocaine, heroin, opiates. And they're the kind of drugs I have in mind. And if there are other drugs out there that people are sort of beginning to use recreationally or whatever that are considered to have low damage, I'm not aware of them. So if they exist, there's something else that I talked about. Maybe there's an argument to be made there. I suppose I divide it into kind of, roughly speaking, hard drugs and soft drugs. And we've already heard, for example, Ming made the point, which is so often made, a gateway drug. That people say, look, they're trying to get some cannabis, and actually, by the way, do you want a few pills to go with it, or here's a couple of wraps of cocaine or whatever while you're here. So that's one reason. I think the other reason is, I think it's pretty well documented that hard drugs have a lot more impact in terms of detrimental health consequences. I don't personally see much difficulty in somebody smoking a joint. Bar the carcinogenic, actually, that would be the same with tobacco and cigarettes. I don't think they're particularly good at it either. But it's particularly, that aside, I don't think they're going to go start braising at it. And I think people that are consuming hard drugs have a different health journey and have a different life journey, actually. And one thing that I mentioned, we talked in the earlier session about courts and court procedures and guarded time. I made a point that I don't think it's a great use of guarded time to be running people arrested for drugs on the street or anything else. I see people jumping in. It's hard to keep up with the comments in the chat. I completely agree. Alcohol is the biggest gateway drug. I said earlier on, alcohol, it just replying to a few comments in the chat that are coming in as I'm speaking. Totally, alcohol is. If alcohol was discovered tomorrow, and I've said this in the Dáil in the past, if alcohol was discovered tomorrow, I don't think it would be legalised. I don't think it would be permitted. Indeed, you can buy something for a tenner or a fiver and be completely out of your mind and destroy property, and it may be kind of violent for something that's legal. It kind of beggars belief. But it's an historical anomaly because it was discovered, whatever, 3 or 4, are brought to, it's been used for millennia, but I suppose in large quantities for several hundred years, since we had sort of excise duties and all that sort of stuff. So anyway, sorry, that's just to reply to that comment brief about alcohol. Totally, it's a gateway drug. But the point about hard drugs and soft drugs, I mentioned court time. I train as a barrister, and that's, I suppose, my profession outside of politics. I haven't seen that many cases. In times I've been before, I've represented people in criminal trials. I've represented people who've been accused of holding drugs. I haven't seen that many cases in the time that I've been in the courts where people were actually arrested or brought into court on small quantities. I've probably seen a couple. I haven't seen very many at all. But I've seen hundreds. And my colleagues, when I was my colleagues that will be doing this full time, they have seen like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases all the time of people not being brought in because of drugs use per se, but being fallen foul of something else while they're on drugs or because of a difficulty in their background. So people who have addiction difficulties, and they have all kinds of difficulties, all kinds of challenges in their life, It could be their background, their mother or father, parents, their family upbringing. It could be themselves, they became addicted at an early age. So I would say, no, there aren't a huge amount of cases before the courts of people with small degrees of drug use being charged for possession and using up court time. But there are multiple examples of people who have been charged with other offences, and the reason they're in that difficulty and in those challenging circumstances, a lot of it goes back to the use of hard drugs as opposed to soft drugs, either by them or by their parents. So I would be concerned for those reasons as to proposals to legalise what I call hard drugs. Maybe other people call them something else. But like I say, I'm open to persuasion. If there's a particular new drug that is seen to be low impact, low health consequences, tell me about it, and I'll take a listen. But I'm not aware of it.
Thank you very much.
I'm not talking now. Yeah.
Oh, you're fine. I'm just going to be a bit strict now because we have so many interesting questions, I think, in the audience as well. And just to clarify for the future, that was a brilliant answer, but we are going to ignore the chat until the end. I'm sorry to everyone who's sending in their thoughts and opinions, but we are going to keep it moving a bit. So we're going to jump on to you, Aidan, if you could explain why your party is in favour of decriminalising other drugs.
Okay, well, we believe in decriminalising the person. Okay, so, again, it's not about decriminalising a long list of substances. It's about decriminalising the person. And I think in this debate, you have to be clear on language. Legalisation is a very different word to decriminalisation. And whenever I started talking about this, and I've been talking about this since 2014, 2015, is that somebody automatically jumps and says, we're talking about legalization, which means it's going to be sold in Spar and all the rest of it. I said, no, this is about the person. And why do we feel strongly about this? Well, if you look at Portugal, which 20 years ago decriminalized possession for personal use, and you look at the success what they've had, if you're serious about actually helping people, the reduction in the number of people on heroin maintenance programs or support programs has gone down by 50%, which in an Irish context would mean that we'd have not 10,000 people on methadone maintenance programs, but 5,000. But their overdose rate has gone down by 75%. Now, the challenge actually in this debate is the value we put on these lives. And there are names that, in Irish society, we call people who are afflicted with addiction or have addiction issues. And I know this from my time when I was Minister for Drugs, that if there was a middle-class student who took an overdose in a club because it was a pill, there'd be a lot of media attention around this person. The future this person could have had, all their friends would be interviewed, there'd be talk about the college that person went to, and the stolen life, right? If somebody was reported to have died of a heroin overdose in the toilets of Connolly Station, which happens, or Dunstores in Cork, which happens, it doesn't get much media comment, because the view is that it's the person's own fault. So we have a very classist view of this entire argument, and we have to get back to the fundamentals of the argument, which is about the person. Now, I disagree with Colin that's saying that, we will just park our views until we have a citizens' assembly or a constitutional convention. Well, there was a constitutional convention on marriage equality. It was one of 9 different issues that were discussed. But, the Labour Party had a view on that before you had the constitutional convention. I think it's important that political parties will forward a view on where we stand on these issues. Now, again, in all these things and all these big social battles that have been won over the years, language has been very, very important. So in terms of decriminalisation, the point here is that it's about the person. It's about taking the person out of the criminal justice system and wrapping a state, embrace of care around that person. I mean, other arguments have been made which are very valid, and listen to what Luke has said. But if you're if you're the parent of a young person who comes home and you find, let's say, cannabis or something, and that's clearly for their own personal use in their satchel or in their bag, are you less or more likely to engage with authorities if you think your child is going to get a criminal record?
And what's happened is that people are getting sucked into using, low-level drugs, and then they are dealing low-level drugs, and then they're getting drug debt, and then this drug debt is being doubled and tripled, and then you have people who have like 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 quid, and nobody can put their hand up and say, actually, my child's involved in this because it's a shame. And what's killing, hundreds of people a year in this country is the shame that's being attached to drug use and to drug addiction. So not only do we have to decriminalize the user, we have to de-shame our language, because it is remarkable the number of people who will approach me, and I'm quite sure the other guests will say the same, who will speak in silent, hushed terms about the people in their lives who've been affected by this issue. But they couldn't say it openly because they'll be judged. There isn't a family in this country, there is not one family in this country who can honestly say they do not have an addiction issue. Not one family. Be it alcohol, be it gambling, be it pornography, be it whatever. There isn't a single family. But we are determined to have a 1920s prohibition USA view of the modern drugs issue in Ireland. And what happened in the 20s in America, it spawned the mafia. It spawned the mafia here in Ireland in terms of drugs. It doesn't work. Let's decriminalize the person and let's have an adult conversation about it.
That is great, Aidan. Thank you for your response. As a linguistics student, I can't help but be taken by the idea you've mentioned, of removing the stigma from our language, because it really does have a tangible effect on who's seeking treatment, on who's even developing addictions in the first place. So, interesting point. I'm going to move on to you now, Gino. So you said yes, your party would be in favour of decriminalising other drugs. Could you explain that to me, please? Why?
Yeah, I mean, I think Aidan has said that, we have to kind of, I suppose, explain what decriminalisation means. Because some people think that it's about legalising all drugs. That's a different debate for a different night. So decriminalisation is about decriminalising the person, regardless of what drugs they have in their possession. So our party is fully in favour of that model, and that model, I mean, a lot of I suppose public representatives and people look at the model in Portugal, where it has kind of minimised harm, it has saved lives, it has kind of challenged all the, I suppose, the byproducts of drug use, because drug use is in some ways a very, very, very ugly business, and the damages that it does to communities, individuals, is incalculable. So we can't get away from that. You can't run away from that. But I think you have to be honest with people. You have to treat them like adults. Drugs are more prevalent than they ever were. And all the laws that we have in this state at this moment makes it illegal to hold and possess any of them drugs. Yes, at the same time, people are using drugs. Not everybody uses drugs by any means, but they're in society. And the violence that comes with some of them drugs, where the void is being filled, is sickening. The intimidation that comes with drugs is sickening. And all this happens in a vacuum. Not too far from here, there's kids that are on the canal, and they sell drugs every single night to people, right? So it's like a supermarket, right? So people come from all over certain parts of where I am to get exactly what they want, right? So that's in a vacuum. People obviously want certain drugs, and that's in that's the demand. Just the hypocrisy in society is pretty sickening, because we have 10,000 people are on methadone, and methadone is a heroin substitute. And we have society, the establishment has allowed that to happen. And it's a class issue. It's an issue of equality. It's an issue of kind of disparity between incomes, and where you see kind of drugs where they kind of manifest themselves. So decriminalization, I think, is a model, but we need to go beyond decriminalization and have a really strong debate about legalization and the reasons why people, take drugs. Because if you don't challenge the inequality in society and the reasons why people take certain drugs and kind of the alienation and the poverty that exists, then it's going to be harder kind of to sell the issue of decriminalization and legalization. And they're kind of both of the juxtaposition that we talk about, the decriminalization and legalization. Because anybody that, is skirting around this idea or kind of talking about, that these models don't work, literally have their head in the sand. And it does come to it's a class issue around drug use, and all sorts of people use drugs, by the way. But the people that have really kind of have fared the worst have been the poorer people in society, and that's always been the way. And that's the reason why I think you need to go beyond decriminalization, particularly around certain drugs. Thanks.
Great. Very nice. And again, we're going to move on to Luke. So this is a more personal question for you, as you're not affiliated with the party. But could you explain?
I think criminalizing people for using any drugs does not improve their life. It makes their life worse. It puts their life in more danger. It prevents them getting help, and we shouldn't do it. It is undeniably harmful to the user to criminalize them for using drugs. The only purpose, as far as I can see, for criminalizing heroin users is for good headlines for politicians to bring a community on side who are really, really desperate and looking for a solution. But fortunately, there are other solutions out there. Everyone alludes to the Portuguese system. You treat it as a health issue. Way before they did this in Portugal, in a place called Witness. Now, I'm a bit of a sports anorak, so Witness to me, up until then, was a rugby league team who used to dominate rugby league. But Witness to me now is a sign of hope. And a man called Kevin Williamson wrote a brilliant book. I've been in contact with and spoken to him since. I suggest you follow him on Twitter, a book called Drugs and the Party Line. And it was about an experiment that took place in Witness near Liverpool in the mid-1990s. And they gave heroin and cocaine to addicts. Horror. Can you imagine even suggesting it? I think I'm kind of radical enough as a politician, but I know I get a political belt for saying it. But to hell with me. It's not about me and it's not about us. It's about what is right. And I'll let you know, and how could anyone have a problem with this? An example of some of the things that happened in Witness when they stopped criminalizing them and provided desperate people with what they were looking for. Between July of 1988 and January of 1990, the then Cheshire Drug Squad began tracking the criminal records of 112 addicts who entered the drug maintenance program. It recorded a 93% drop in theft, burglary and property crimes. The local Marks, I know this off by heart, the local Marks and Spencer store donated 10,000 sterling to the experiment. Guess why? There was no one robbing their shop anymore because people didn't need to. HIV infection rates among injecting users was 0. Who could have a problem with this? And the incidence of death among addicts, normally 15% a year, was also 0. I'm not making this up. This is from a psychiatrist. One side effects, and I find this very interesting, and surely everyone who has heroin dealers in their area should be delighted to hear this. One side effects which Dr. Marks did not expect, though, was a drop in new users. The police found that drug dealers simply stayed away from Halton, this is one of the areas, because they knew the local addicts no longer needed their services. They also couldn't get desperate heroin addicts to become dealers because they didn't need to become dealers to fund their habit and to make sure someone else became an addict so they could fund their habit. But I can't let it go, though, that the reality is nearly absolutely everyone uses drugs. Whether you eat to make yourself feel nice as opposed to fill your belly, which many people do, whether you drink coffee, and there is evidence out there that it can cause problems with people who already are predisposed to schizophrenia. We all pretty much use drugs. Some of us, though, have been lumbered with a criminal record, and some of us have been put down because of it, for whatever reason. So, to me, decriminalize, because criminalizing people doesn't help anyone who uses drugs. Absolutely no one. There's proof out there that this can work and can do well. It's not perfect, but it has to be better than torturing people who are not well. And if all I can say is, I have 3 daughters, and hopefully it won't happen, but if any of them have addiction problems in the future, all I can say is the worst possible thing anyone can do to my kids is to criminalize them on top of the other issues that they would have had to become an addict in the first place. I just think it's bizarre. It's like criminalizing overeating to solve obesity. It's crazy.
Well, thank you for that, Luke. Those were some very interesting statistics. I'm sure loads of people in the audience and maybe even our guest speakers are surprised. I know I was. So thanks for that. We're going to move on to the next question, which is kind of a loaded question, and I'm sure everyone has their own thoughts. But could you just give a thumbs up if you and your party think that the current punishments for possession of other drugs are fair? So if the punishments are fair, put your thumbs up. Right. Okay. Perfect. So I'm going to ask you all the next question, which is, if you think that these punishments are unfair, what are you doing to change them? We need to see tangible action. So I'm going to ask what your party has done in the past few years to change the current punishments. So you can go first, Colm, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think the area of law hasn't been changed to a great extent over the last number of years, but that's the reason why we now need to look at the whole area, making sure that, say, for argument's sake, someone who is found with drugs which they claim is for personal use, and all of the other speakers have raised about looking at the law in that area. The law is still in place there, so if you are found in possession, even if they're for your own use, you can still be prosecuted, and that needs to be looked at. And this is a whole issue that needs to be now dealt with in government. As you know, over the last, I suppose, since the formation of the new government, the whole focus has been on the pandemic. It hasn't been possible to look at key areas like this, but it needs to be looked at. And it's about working with people. And, this issue is not something that is there and has arisen over the last 4 to 5 years. I remember my own family working in one of the hospitals in Dublin. And, at the time they were working there, there were a lot of people attending who had serious drug addiction problems, and that's in the 94 to 98. So we're talking about a long period of time where there hasn't been any great change in the law in this area. Now is the time to look at it, but it's about having a comprehensive look at it rather than a piecemeal look at it. And I think that's one of the issues that we need to do. And it's also about having, as I said earlier, that wider discussion about looking at other jurisdictions and seeing what's the best way forward. Because, we have so many people who are here in Ireland for a period of time, then they're living in other jurisdictions, then they come back to Ireland and there are different laws applying. Therefore, that's the reason why we now need to look at it in a comprehensive way rather than a piecemeal way.
Okay, that's great, Colm. Thank you. So just to clarify again, what is the party doing? You've mentioned having a discussion, opening a dialogue. Are these meetings you're having, or are they on paper? Is it phone calls, or kind of everything?
The Programme for Government set out a number of key issues on this area. I'll openly admit they haven't really been touched on over the last, since the government came into office, because of it's mainly dealing with the pandemic. It now needs to look at that and move on in relation to views that are required.
Thank you. Thanks for that again. That was brilliant. And I appreciate you coming and speaking. So next we are going to move on to you, James. You said you and your party think that the current punishments for drug possession are fair. So could you just explain why these punishments are fair in your words now? Thank you. James, you're on mute there. If you could turn your mic back on.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. We can hear you.
Sorry. So I guess, look, again, I'm a little bit maybe biased, or I sort of have a different perspective because I studied law and because I practiced law and I've represented people who are before the courts on these kind of charges. So I might have a slightly different view to the norm on this. I suppose the reason I say that in many cases they are fair is because most legislation in this or any other types of offences gives quite a broad spectrum of potential penalty. And it's up to a given judge on a given day in a given circumstances to decide what penalty is fair. And generally, I think the judges get it right because they don't generally throw people in jail for having small quantities of drugs for possession. They don't generally criminalise people unless they really have to, or if they've gone way too far. In actual fact, they by and large tend to give people the benefit of the doubt. They tend to allow people make amends in other ways, and they tend to go out of their way to actually allow people to escape without arrest. So, so there's that. I think as well, the Misuse of Drugs Act has the provisions for that. One of the sections of that deals with penalties, and they have been dealt with. So that's been updated numerous times, including 2021. There's a couple of statutory instruments within. But one of the things, for example, that has been done in recent years is they've revised it into categories of Class A, Class B, Class C, which doesn't necessarily correspond to what people talk about as Class A drugs. But there's different structures there of sanction. And it would recognise, for example, so the Misuse of Drugs Act, as it stands, as amended, already says that if someone's got a small quantity of cannabis for personal use, that's not in the same category as a harder drug. So a lot of that's actually already there. It may not be public knowledge, but if anyone wants to look at the Misuse of Drugs Act and look where it's at, generally that's been applied. And I say what I've seen before the courts would suggest that judges have live in the real world and look at each particular offender in each particular case. And see what sanction is merited, if any, and very often it isn't any. It's kind of probation or it's macro community service, or outside trouble. It's clean. That would happen in many cases, unless people have multiple convictions, which is a different story. And many of those things as well don't actually, I think, come before the courts because there's a degree of discretion there whether they bring them in the first place.
That's great, James. Thank you for that. Thank you for bringing your perspective. Colm, I am aware that you have prior engagements, so you're heading off at 7, right?
Yeah, I'll stay for about another 10 minutes. I want to listen to the reply, so I'll move on then. But I do have a meeting which is starting at 7.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for attending. It is really brilliant how eager Fine Gael and you specifically have been to get involved in this dialogue, and I know it means a lot to everyone that's attending, everyone who organised, and the general community. So it's really an honour to have you here. So we're going to move on to you, Aidan, and you think the current punishments are unfair. Could you tell us why? Aidan, you have yourself on mute there.
Apologies. I just was saying that I do a bit of work with Peter McVerry, who has spoken about being in court with a young man who was being charged for possession of cannabis to the worth of €2. The point isn't how the court system is sympathetic or otherwise. The point is, what the hell are they doing in the courtroom in the first place? Now, I've been down to the drug court, which is being promoted in certain circles as being the way forward because it's much more benign, it's much more empowering. But you walk into the drug court and you just see a bunch of sick poor people for the most part, in a courtroom. Now, people who are sick don't belong in a courtroom talking to a judge. If you are sick, unwell, or have an addiction issue, you should be talking to a counsellor or a doctor or a nurse or somebody from a medical background who can help you. You don't belong in a courtroom in the first place. And that's the I think that's the whole point. So what I would say about what we have done, like I championed as minister the injecting centre legislation, which is now law, and in fairness, that did happen in government with Fine Gael. And it got support from every single political party, and it wasn't objected to by anybody at the time, because the whole point was, and that was a form of decriminalisation, because the idea was that it is the possession of drugs and heroin, for the most part, was decriminalised in a particular location between X hour and Y hour. Now, the argument is not whether the argument over that legislation is over because it's law. The argument is over where that centre will be, and there's a court case over where objecting to the site of Merchants Quay in Dublin at the moment. But it is now law to have decriminalisation of possession in a particular location for a particular length of time. And the argument behind that is that if somebody is so, addicted to something, that they will go and jeopardise their own lives by either overdosing or contracting HIV or hepatitis C, why are we, and then leaving stuff behind them, and sometimes defecating on the street as well because of your bodily reaction? Why are we forcing people behind skips and in stairwells and in parks and playgrounds to do that? Why don't we find somewhere humane, as 88 other cities across Europe have done, where you can do this safely, securely, with medical attention, and nobody has ever overdosed fatally in a medically supervised injecting centre. Now, that is law of the land to have such a centre. It's law. So we've done that. We've achieved that as a political collective. There wasn't a huge row about it. The row is about where it's going to be, not about the concept. So I think there is potential for the political system to actually, in that instance, they put the person at the centre of it. They viewed the person and said, you know something, it is an insult to demand of that person to behave in that way. We can humanize that person by providing a safe, secure place. Do what they're going to do anyway. Mm-hmm. The fact about drugs, I'll make this final point. This decriminalization argument is very unlikely to decrease the level of drug use. It's a bit like teenage sex. People used to argue, well, if you tell people more about it, they'll just do it more, right? And but what we began to do because of teenage pregnancy and because of diseases and all the rest of it, and the AIDS crisis in the 80s, was to inform young people. So yes, people I'm quite sure, are having more sex than ever, underage, possibly, I don't know, or certainly in teenage years. But the level of teenage pregnancy has gone down, and the level of sexually transmitted disease has come under much more control than it was. So the point really is, it might be a bad comparison, but the ambition here is not that necessarily people will take less drugs, because that's a big claim that decriminalization it can't stack up. But the big win is that people won't die, and their lives won't be destroyed by a criminal conviction. That's the big win. And I think there's enough people within politics who could put that to the centre of what they're trying to do. We did that in government and getting the injecting centre thing over the line. We can do it again with a decriminalisation policy. I believe, if you listen to Peter McVerry, who everybody wants to support and champion as a homeless campaigner, but he has said, give heroin to heroin addicts. Give it to them, just as Lucas said, give it to them. And what's the big problem? What's the big moral objection? Because it just doesn't sit easily with you. Well, it's not up to you to decide. The state should have a positive involvement in these lives. And guess what then? The person on the receiving end is going to have a much more positive relationship with the state. They're going to feel that the state is actually on their side, that the HSE, the guards, the criminal justice system, the politics in general actually is coming and relating with them where they are, rather than some completely unobtainable, lionized view of their lives, which is just an impossible reach for a lot of people. So look, that's what we have done in the past. That's what I believe we can do in the future. But for the love of God, can we all just put the person at the centre of what we're trying to do?
Thank you. Very interesting points as always. So we're now going to go on to you, Gino. And just to refresh your mind now, does your party think the current punishments for possession of drugs are fair? And you've said no. Would you explain why?
Well, I'll be brief, and I want to commend Aidan and his work in relation to supervised injection centres. I think it's a very, very worthwhile harm reduction policy, and hopefully it can be see its reality hopefully very soon. And just in relation to the Misuse of Drugs Act, they were kind of obviously created in the 1970s, and you know, they're used as a deterrent. You know, the laws, the criminal justice system is used as a deterrent for against people using drugs. Now that has failed. You know, I'd be amazed if anybody can tell you that it has worked, but it's largely failed. And that deterrent hasn't stopped people from using drugs and then getting into, you know, the criminal justice system and going into prison. So you'll find a huge percentage of people that are in our prisons at the moment are there for drugs, either for personal use, less so, but usually for the sale of drugs, and that could be from all sorts of drugs. So the deterrent hasn't essentially worked because it's driving people into the criminal justice system. And I would go as far that, you know, prohibition has the byproducts of prohibition has led to this fraternity of criminals. People like the Kinahans, which are scumbags, right? Scum, right? They don't live anywhere near in working class estates. They live in Dubai, you know. So these, you know, individuals and their cohorts are kind of are no working class heroes by any means. They're businessmen and they sell their products, and they don't care who they sell it to. There's no regulation, and they fill that vacuum in. So there's a whole cohort of people in prison because of you know, drugs. So we'd be talking about the same thing in 10 to 15 years if we do not do something different. So because the present laws around drugs simply don't work, right? And I go back to the point where, you know, drug use is not a glamorous business by any means, right? As I said, I've seen how it can, you know, literally destroy communities and destroy individuals, right? And we used to do things differently back in the 80s and 90s when I was growing up. You know, communities, you know, used to march on people's houses. You know, I could understand why they done that at the time, but you know, we're still in a situation where drugs still take lives, and they still are kind of an insidious kind of you know, culture that exists in working class communities. There's an alternative economy that exists in working class areas where individuals and groups can do unbelievably well out of drug supply, right? They do unbelievably well, very financially really well rewarded. So there's young people as 15, 16, younger than that, selling like heroin, crack, coke, everything, you know. But this all exists in a void. It all exists in a vacuum. So does the criminal justice system and kind of prison, is it a deterrent? In some ways, I think it can be, but that alone, trying to persuade people from taking drugs or supplying drugs simply doesn't work. And we got to look at a new system, how people, you know, the supply and demand, the reasons for why people take drugs in the first place.
Okay, thanks, Gino. That was great. Some great points raised again, as always. If I must say so myself, I think our whole panel are on fire tonight. You're really knocking it out of the park. So thanks again for coming and speaking to us. So Luke, we'll move on over to you. I believe you said you don't think the current punishments are fair. So if you could talk a little bit as to why that is, and maybe what are you doing to try and change them?
Well, I don't think they're fair, because if you look at what's the goal of these laws and the punishment stemming from them, it's to make society a better place. And I don't think it makes someone a better person or an improved person if you jail them for using drugs. Well, for a start, if you got jailed for possession of cannabis and you refuse a fine, you probably have more chance of getting heroin in a prison than you will of cannabis, because it takes you longer to get cannabis out of your system. So people move over to heroin because it pisses out of your system quicker. So I do not see how tougher criminal records are going to improve. I'm just thinking of my old lad, loves Guinness. And if I said to him that in the morning, would you stop drinking it if it was illegal? He'd laugh at me at the whole concept that someone could stop him doing something that he enjoyed, that he does in moderation most of the time, and enjoys with his friends. You know, the idea that somehow he'd be a criminal in the morning would solve all the alcoholics' problems in the country is ludicrous. So I don't think tougher punishment is going to do anything at all to get us out of the situation that we're currently in, because it gets cranked up. I remember John O'Donoghue, I ran in the election in 1997. Punish every crime. Well, bar a lot that were at themselves, but punish every crime. Zero tolerance. Well, like, they got elected. They ran the country. I don't recall drugs disappearing. There was mandatory 10-year sentences. I don't recall that really changing anything. And even since 1997, it's far easier to get all of these drugs anywhere in the country now. So tougher sentencing is a waste of money. It destroys people. It damages their family. It disconnects parents from their children. And it's just a bad idea. But one more thing, I'm delighted to hear Aidan say that Father Peter McVerry believes that a way to deal with it would be to actually give heroin addicts heroin. Well, I suggested that to someone once, and they said, should they be coming from everywhere looking for it? Wouldn't that be fantastic news? You then would know all the people who were using it. You would eventually find out who the problem users were. You would have access to them, to help their families. Whereas at the moment, we really don't know what is going on, and we have zero control over the situation. So, I mean, no, more punishment the current punishment at the moment is ridiculous. And I suppose that's obvious, because I think they should all be decriminalized.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you so much for your response. So the next question is one that is quite close to home for our society specifically. To give a bit of context, UCC SSDP have a history of doing workshops to demonstrate how to use a drug testing kit, how to test your drugs to make sure they're safe. And we also had a history of giving them out, so that people who were going to use these substances regardless at least are a little bit safer. But unfortunately, we are no longer permitted to do this, mainly because of the college policy, which stems from the Department of Justice and the Department of Health. So we were wondering, in relation to harm reduction, does your party support the construction of safe injection sites, drug testing labs, and the provision of drug testing kits? So if you could put up your hand or a thumbs up or something if your party does support that. Okay, perfect. So yes, Gino, yes, Aidan. James, I can't see you, so I'm not too sure what you've said, but perfect. We're going to go to you first, James, if you don't mind. Yes or no? I can't hear you there, James. Could you turn on your microphone, please? Sorry about this now. Okay. Maybe we'll move on for the time being, and we'll go with you first, Adon. I believe you said yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'd ask, what are you doing to bring this into fruition? What are you actually doing currently with your party to make sure tester kits or labs or injection sites are going to be brought to the public?
Right. Well, as I said, the injection sites legislation has been passed and is law. It's only permissible for one. I think it needs to be amended so that we can roll it out. At this stage, I really would have hoped that we had proved it was a success. I saw one of the comments there saying that a mobile injecting centre would be better, and in fact, a lot of the business communities were hoping for a mobile centre. But the feeling was that where the person who was going to use the injecting site is coming from, they prefer to have a regular place that they are comfortable with, and that they can be helped within. And I think that's a reasonable aspiration. In all these things, look. And I don't think there needs to be a huge political debate about this. We have to just ask ourselves, just as we have in the past, and I mentioned sex education before, like we get the moralization out of this for a second, and how we all pretend that we want people to live their lives. Because we all live imperfect lives. All of us live imperfect lives. All of us are liable to have stresses on us at one point or another, and to do things that we would regret, and all of us have done things that we regret. But you have to come back to the point that what is the point here is to reduce harm and to save lives, and what on balance is going to reduce harm and save lives. And there is, of course, the counter argument of glorification and normalization and all the rest of it. But for so many people, this is a normal activity already. So if you were to educate and to empower and to equip, then you are much less likely to have tragedy. And that's the way that I view things. That's the way my party views things. And I think in general, it's like, I would say this much though as well. I mean, I know you have problems in your own campus on this issue. I think there's enough goodwill in Irish society to go on a journey on this. I know a lot of people will look at this issue and say it doesn't affect them, or they don't understand it, or these terms are like harm reduction or decriminalization are alien to them. I think there's enough people in Irish society who would be willing to listen and to toss over and debate as to why this is important, without demonizing people, without calling people names, or saying, like, we can't advocate for people in addiction to not be called names, and then for us collectively to call people who don't agree with us names. So I think there's a great opportunity for us to humanize the debate and to properly put forward the reasons as to why these things are important, because effectively we're trying to reduce harm, and we're trying to save lives and improve and enhance lives, and that's the point of the exercise. So that's where we're coming from.
Thanks. So now that we know where you are coming from and where the party is coming from, are there any actions that you are taking to bring this to fruition that you'd like to discuss?
Yeah, I mean, look, we put out our policy paper there in 2018 around decriminalization and a more inclusive and a more humane drug policy. We want to bring that to the next stage and introduce legislation around it. We don't want to have a divisive debate in the Oireachtas where it's like, we're on the side of the angels and everybody who doesn't agree with us is in the dark ages. I think a forum like this has been really, really beneficial to get every political entity in a room and to start talking about it. But I have great faith. Like I mentioned before, like sometimes Irish politics and maybe some of your contributors or people who are listening in, throw their eyes into heaven when it comes to Irish politics and political life. But I'll say one thing about the Irish political system: there is no single mainstream political party that goes on an anti-immigrant platform at election time. I think we're unique in Europe on that. It's very unusual, and Luke can speak to this, not to have a mainstream political party that has a kind of an anti-immigrant platform at election time, and immigration becomes an election issue in a general. That doesn't happen in Ireland because nobody has really gone there. Not saying it won't happen, but nobody has really gone there. So I think that's one thing. And then when I spoke about what happened previously in my experience in terms of drug policy, there was a collective understanding of the necessity to do something and to change something, and for people who were really, really on the edges, and that got support from right across the house. So I think the potential is there, and the middle ground is there for us to really move in a direction we all want to go. If this becomes my party is better than your party, or this party in governments is letting us all down, well then we're all going to fail, because I think politics has a chance to actually achieve something when we do it together. If this becomes government are bad because they don't agree with us, well, that's fine. That's a comfortable space, and it can be a comfortable space for somebody like me. It's not going to move the situation on them.
Right. So just to clarify for the audience, your party are indeed in favour of the construction of different harm reduction buildings or institutions, like safe injection sites, testing labs, testing kits, and the actions that you're taking currently would be contained in the bill you've introduced?
Well, we haven't introduced the bill yet, but I mean that is all part of what we're trying to achieve. Yeah,
right.
But by the way, it's one thing to introduce. There's one thing to introduce legislation. It's a second sort of cultural argument for us to change the mindset of the people, and that's something that we all have a duty in.
Definitely. Thank you. Thanks for that. I'm just going to double check if James is with us. Right. Okay. Well, then we'll move on to Eugenio. Welcome back. Just to refresh your mind, we were asking if your party support the construction of safe injection sites, drug testing labs, and the provision of drug testing kits. So you said yes to this, didn't you?
Yeah.
Could you explain a bit why you said yes, and also what steps are your party taking to bring this into action?
Well, it's kind of simple, really. Answer. It's in relation to harm reduction, and those people that choose to, use drugs, there should be provision there if the substance that they have should be tested. For example, I think this should be widespread in festivals and things like that, where where you want to use certain drugs, they should be able to get them tested to see if they're not going to kill them. So that provision should be there. And we obviously touched on about in relation to the supervised injection room. Obviously, I think there should be one in Dublin and Cork, where there is obviously a manifestation of people that use heroin. Because I think the more we kind of, talk about it, educate people, I think we will have better outcomes. And people are adults; they make adult choices. Sometimes them choices we don't agree with. Sometimes them choices are bad choices. But they're adults, and they can make a conversant decision in relation to certain substances that we have. So I think it's the approach that is harm reduction, and kind of health-led approach. I know the HSE are using this language, which is good. The way forward in relation to why people use drugs, and the consequences of using them drugs. So more regulation, and more kind of I suppose education in relation to what drugs people take. There is side effects to everything. There's a huge problem in this country, not well listed drugs, but drugs are made by pharmaceutical companies. And pharmaceutical companies make vast amounts of money on drugs that are in a small blister packet, in a box, and are sold at quite inflated prices. Sometimes these drugs do the exact same thing as, drugs that are kind of send people to prison. So the pharmaceutical industry have a lot to answer for. But yet these are kind of lauded as, they do employ a lot of people. But there's a huge problem in this country in relation to prescribed drugs. And that's another debate that we need to have. And that's kind of that genie's out of the bottle, and it's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to come back in the bottle anytime fast. That's, as I said, that's a different debate. But I think it's the way forward in relation to harm reduction, a health-led approach, and people making, educated choices, and giving them the kind of liberty to do that. That's it. Thanks.
Perfect. So just again, so our audience get kind of the baseline there, what people before profit are really doing is trying to raise awareness and open a dialogue around these types of harm reduction. So I'm going to go on to you, Luke, now, and we will go back to James afterwards.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah,
Perfect.
I agree totally with the idea of testing kits, and I think Aidan's analogy of comparing it to underage sex, or I would say sex in general, is a very good comparison, because we tried in this country to deal with the fact that for some strange reason, people wanted to have sex by attempting to ban it, pretty much criminalizing it. Like, we didn't just give them a slap on the wrist in court. We put them in, well, basically institutions. And we tried basically to ban sex. But you know what? People like having sex. People like using drugs. So you can ban them all you want, because people will find a way around it. And the logic of being against testing kits, because it'll encourage more people to use drugs, supposedly, is the same logic that was there when I was in first year in college. I'm old, but I'm not that old. When we couldn't legally buy condoms. And you know the reason why we couldn't use condoms in Ireland? Because it might encourage people to have more sex if there were condoms. So it is as simple as this. We're discouraging you. But if you do have unprotected sex, tough luck. Because you know what? You're not my type of person. I don't represent you. And likewise, nowadays, for people who use drugs. So to me, it makes total sense. I think the question is, do you want to make drug use safer for people who are going to use drugs anyway? Yes, I do.
Perfect. That's brilliant. Thank you for that. The condom analogy, I think, is very apt, and I've thought this many times before, especially the interesting parallel between people smuggling condoms in across the border or bringing them back in their suitcase. I think we all have relatives that have stories about that, if we don't have stories about it ourselves. So it is interesting to see where the dialogue is at the moment. So James, if you don't mind now, we'll go back to you. And just to refresh your mind, we were asking, does your party support the construction of safe injection sites, drug testing labs, and the provision of drug testing kits?
Yeah, I had to step away there. I got a call there. It's at my 10th Zoom meeting of the day, and another 2 to do before I get in. So it's been a long day. So I apologize, I had to take a call there. Drug testing kits I'm not familiar with, to be honest. Other than I'm not sure, are they be used by law enforcement, or why would people use them? I'm not quite sure the context of that question is. Maybe if you could elaborate, or someone could elaborate, I can give a.
Perfect.
Yeah. So
drug testing kits are not really encouraged at the moment because they aren't a fail-safe. They aren't 100% reliable. They won't tell you, okay, this is exactly what's in the powder you're testing. But people generally, the most common ones you get would be purity tests. So if someone wants to test what they think is MDMA, they can get a test and find out that it's 100% MDMA, or they could find out that it's only 5%. And in that case, maybe there's a lot of adulterants, maybe some very toxic substances in there. So we as a society had a history of issuing out those drug testing kits to help people on campus be more safe. Drug testing labs then would be the more scientific, more accurate version of a tester kit. Generally, people would bring in a drug or send it in to see what's in it or how safe it is. And safe injection sites, I think, are quite self-explanatory. So just to ask again, what's your party's stance on this?
Yeah, so there's no issue with the self-injection sites or supported injection sites. I think that's part of what's already. Drug testing kits, that's a new one on me. I completely get the idea now you've explained it. So is somebody buying a mysterious powder on campus or on the street or whatever, and they're not necessarily what it is, before they sniff it or snort it or inject it or whatever, that they can actually be sure that it is something that's not going to kill them or harm them, or even that it is what it's supposed to be. It's not baking soda or whatever. So yeah, look, I'd say not something I'm familiar with. Not something I realised was in regular use, common use, but I can see the logic behind it completely. I suppose it is somewhat ironic that the only place drugs are tested are if they're confiscated and sent off to the forensic science laboratory, and then there's a full analysis done. But before somebody puts it into their body, there's no such analysis. It's a bit like buying a bottle of hooch off the side of the street instead of in a supermarket. And bad and all this drink is, and just to reiterate the point I made earlier, I think what the speakers have made, I'm absolutely convinced if drink was invented now or discovered now, it would be treated in the exact same way as many other drugs, if not even more seriously. But being as it is out there and it is legal, if you buy a bottle, you can look at the side of it and see what percentage proof it is: 5%, 4% beer, 15% wine, 40% whiskey, whatever. The easiest part of the problem with poaching was because that wasn't there, and people used to buy bottles of it, and nobody kind of whether it was 100%, 80% proof, or 20% proof, or whatever, and it was too late before you realised. So yeah, look, that all makes perfect sense.
Thank you. Great answer. So just to clarify, at this moment, Fianna Fáil are not doing anything to bring more testing kits or drug testing labs into the country?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. It's always good to hear everyone's different opinions, everyone's different thoughts, and the actions that they're all taking. It's lovely to hear. So thank you very much. So I think that's it for our questions, and if you don't mind, we might take a few from the audience, if that sounds okay with everyone here. Okay. So if anyone in the audience has a question, they can raise their hand. You can see it in the top bar of your screen next to the little chat bubble, like this. Okay. So let's see who has their hands up. We have Fiacra Bissett. Do you want to go ahead with your question?
Yeah. I have epilepsy and I've been living with it for 3 years, and this form of epilepsy can't properly be treated with drugs that are currently legal. I've tried a lot of different ones and they don't work. So there was a medical program introduced a few years ago, but it was incredibly restrictive and didn't really allow the vast majority of epileptics or any chronic pain patients to get access to cannabis. And even after the expansion of the program, it's been really restrictive. So I'm wondering if, like, especially I'd be interested to hear what James has to say about this, what their party policy is on it. And if the answer is solely to expand the medical program, then how can we actually trust that party, given the fact that in the past it's essentially just been a way to placate people and patients?
That was a great question. So I believe you were directing this at everyone, but specifically James as well. So if we start with James, that would be perfect.
Yeah, so what I can do there, Fiacra, so I think you had the same question there in the chat window. I've been kind of keeping an eye on the chat as well. And what I can do is I can take that away for you. I can't give you a comprehensive answer now. I'm not a party spokesperson on drugs, so I don't want to give you a wrong steer on it. But I'm happy to take it away. And if you want to maybe even drop me a chat through Emily afterwards, I can go to the relevant department and try and get you a steer on that.
Brilliant, thanks a million.
Okay, that is brilliant. Yeah, Fiacra, I will maybe send you a message or leave my email in the chat or the SSDP email, and you can get on to us, and maybe we can all liaise about that in the future. So I believe someone else had their hand up. Daniel, do you want to go ahead?
Hiya, can you hear me?
Yeah. Perfect.
And I just wonder what the panelists thinks if we go beyond decriminalization for possession on drugs. And do they think that the government should implement alternatives for punishment for many low-level actors in the drug trade, including those involved in the social supply of drugs, drug carriers and cultivators of illegal drugs, as many of these people engage in the trade non-violently and do so to alleviate their social economic marginalization?
Okay, perfect. That's a really good question. So if anyone in particular would like to start, I'll let you pick yourselves, as long as there's no scrapping in the square. Okay, Adon, there you go.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one because a lot of the community have moved a long way on this argument as well. And Gino spoke about this before. I mean, it was from within the community, and I used to represent the North Inner City in Dublin, that this idea of mandatory minimum sentencing actually came up in the first place, the 10-year thing. And it just didn't work. It just didn't work. And I suppose we have to have a proper discussion as to how this whole area, begins in the first instance, how somebody gets sucked into it, to properly understand and try and challenge it. It's quite silent and it's quite under the radar, but it's eating away at communities. The biggest thing one of the biggest things in my constituency is the issue of drug debt. And the entire way that we're managing this, if we were actually trying to find a way of managing this whole area the worst possible way, if you decided, right lads, there's 10 of you in the room, this is the problem, all of you have to come up with the best way of dealing with it in your view and the worst way of dealing with it. I think you couldn't actually find a worse way of dealing with it than we currently are. If you're trying to find a way of maintaining drug gangs, drug overlords, drug millionaires, drug murder, if you're trying to maintain that and maintain a system where people are overdosing at a disproportionate rate, dying at a disproportionate rate, and being addicted at a disproportionate rate, you couldn't find a better system than the one we have at the moment. There's nowhere in the world that has changed their system and has gone back. Nowhere in the world. So obviously there's a Middle Ireland issue with people who need to be convinced as to what this really means if we're going to change our approach. But the mid-90s and the drug marches, as has been mentioned, the very tough approach that was advocated at that time, the very same people who were on those marches, leading those marches and speaking at that time, are now saying something very, very, very different as to how this whole area needs to be approached. So, look, the states are looking at very differently. Interestingly, actually, the UK have a very regressive, backward view of this whole area. They haven't come anywhere near where other countries, I was going to say EU countries, other countries in Europe have come. But I think before, like I've said it, there is an open door on this. If you listen to what Jack Nolan has said, who's the former Assistant Garda Commissioner, who is quite a vociferous advocate for decriminalisation, those in the Garda sphere who we tell to enforce these outdated and ineffectual laws are also coming around to the fact that they just can't do it. We're asking them to do something that's impossible.
Okay, thanks for that answer. That was brilliant. So is there anyone else who'd like to elaborate and answer this question? Yeah. All right, go ahead.
If someone in the morning decides they want to be entrepreneurial and decides they want to sell alcohol, they can go out and basically, if they're a person of good standing, they can go out and get a license and they can sell it, and they're put down as being really innovative and bringing business to an area. The reality is that if we regulate this properly, many of these people potentially who are already doing it at a very low level, growing a few plants and supplying a few people, not because they want to be bad people or anything like that, but because they want to pay the bills. In a legal situation, you will have lots of that going on and lots of employment out of it and lots of tax being paid. And actually, an interesting thing you'll have lots of as well. You'll have lots of carpenters doing a lot of work for people, doing little grow houses, etc. So something that's already going on, all in the black market and behind everyone's backs with no one knowing anything about quality, is already going on at the moment. So if you regulate it properly, you create a situation where you could have a whole lot of entrepreneurs out there taking money from the Kinahans and putting it back into their local community and paying their mortgage with this money. So we have a choice, but I always say there's two groups of people in my lifetime who've been most enthusiastic about prohibition, and that's the Kinahans and your average politician in Dáil Éireann, because both of them would go bananas, and always have, if you suggest that the law should change. One for to cover their own political arse, and the others, to protect a market that's been left to them.
Okay, thanks. That's a brilliant answer. There's definitely already a lot of entrepreneurs out there, so I suppose decriminalizing or legalizing would definitely lead to a flourishing legal market. Would anyone else like to answer this question, or will we move on? Okay. If you're happy to move on, then we have a question from Stephen. If you'd want to go ahead now, Stephen.
Yeah, well, basically, it's kind of Luke has come on top of it a bit. I have some business in Spain, and I spend a lot of time in Spain since early 2000s. So I've watched the cannabis social club scene developed here in Spain, and it's one model that in overnight it kind of removes the decriminalization of people for all the cannabis prosecutions that are in the system that are blocking up the system. We know are blocking up the system, and every time it's aired kind of within Irish politics that I ever air it, it's always told that nobody will go down the right to grow. It exists on two tenets: the right to grow and the right to organize yourself in an association. So it's going on for 30 years in Spain, working for 30 years in Spain. It's not legal, but I guarantee you it'll be legal in a year. Everything is kind of talking now because they want the money. Because of COVID, Spain can barely pay the paro, the kind of social welfare, and they know the money that's in the cannabis industry. They know how advanced they are in it, and so they want to do it. Are we ever going to see the right to grow through a Dáil Éireann? That's my question.
And that's a brilliant question. Right.
Yeah, it was contained within the bill that I put before the Dáil, the idea of social clubs where basically a group of people could come together. Let's say 20 people could come together and they'd be allowed 6 planned seats. So 120 of them would be grown within the club, and anyone who's a member of that club can go and participate in it. I've actually one of the best experiences I've ever had using cannabis was in a social club in Barcelona. And the atmosphere was phenomenal. There was no, like you might get in the cafe in Amsterdam, this feeling of they just wanted your money and as much of it as possible for the worst deal possible. There was just a phenomenal atmosphere in there. There were people coming over to you giving advice on how to use a vaporizer or not use a vaporizer. More harm reduction, because it was mentioned earlier that cannabis is carcinogenic. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest there is, but people keep saying it. But if people are worried about that, under the social club model, nearly everyone in there was using a vaporizer. So they were not combusting it. They were not putting tars and horrible substances down on their lung. And it all worked an awful lot better. So that idea of the social club, to be quite honest, for me, if we ever get to a legal situation in Ireland, I'd like to see absolutely every last bit of cannabis that's used in Ireland done through a social club, because then you don't end up with as you do with hard business, a situation where in years to come, you know, they'll be sponsoring football matches, etc. I don't want any of that. I don't like the idea, whether it's advertising alcohol, which is pushing drugs, or advertising cannabis. I don't think it's a good idea. So from that point of view, from the point of view of keeping it away from over commercialization, over pushing, which is what marketing is, pushing, I think the social club model is a phenomenally good model. It works. It's been proven to work. And I would be, I think it's a brilliant idea.
That's great to hear. Thank you for your answer. Comprehensive, detailed, love it.
Would like to hear from some of the other guys if I could.
Yeah, perfect.
Luke is well known on this case, and literally this week I'm very much an advocate of the social club model, because I've seen it working for 20, 30 years. I know the people, I know the presidents of the clubs, I know everything about it. This is a 30-year-old system that works, and but it's based on the right to grow, and that's what I would like to ask Alex and Aidan, for instance. Can we ever see the right to grow passed by an Irish government?
I could come in very quickly if you want, Emily. Look, I think anything is possible. But with all these things, like we're not a decriminalization. We're not decriminalization yet. We still have to have a national debate on it. We're now moving to what you're advocating for, which I don't have an issue with. What helps your cause or the cause is putting science behind it, putting evidence behind it, and showing how it has been successful in other places. And that's going to help. Will we get to that point? I have no difficulty in saying that we could get to that point, but I don't think we're going to get to that point in the very near future. I think there's a number of steps we have to get through before that. We have to have the cultural conversation around this whole area that destigmatizes it. And if I might just stick on that for a second, Emily, because we have weaned ourselves off as a society using terminology in open language about sort of marginalized groups in our society. There was when I grew up a term we used to use for the traveling community that you'd never hear these days in polite society. Certainly wouldn't hear in the media. It's now social and accessible to use that term. Same with the LGBT community. Same with people with disabilities. There's terminology that used to be used openly in debates that's now gone. But there is terminology about those who are who use drugs or who are in drug addiction that can still be used in polite society, and I hear in media frequently. And one of the words begins with J. Now we're not even at that stage yet that we can, take that sort of language, challenge it, change it, and demand that we have a more human debate. So I believe we can get there, but it's going to be a slow process because the starting point where we are is pretty low. That's not to say that we can't get there, but I believe we've a long road to travel. But once we put, as I keep saying, people at the centre of it, and start dispelling the myths that have been out there in the past, there's nothing that can't be achieved.
Thank you. Great answer. So, Gino and James, would you like to answer Stephen's question there? I might go with you first, James, just because you have a different perspective, I would imagine.
Yeah, well, actually, I was kind of interested in Stephen's talking about the social clubs and the I guess the kind of cannabis club or the social club idea. It sounds kind of interesting, and I know it's been kind of maybe piloted in a few other places. So certainly open to hear more about how that would work. I imagine, well, I think it's different to the kind of coffee shop idea. It sounds like more of a social kind of collective co-op type thing where people bring and pool their own resources, maybe hang out together a little bit, but also sort of swap and save type of thing. So there's a bit of a cooperative idea there. It's an interesting idea. The right to grow. Look, again, I suppose as Aon said, look, it's probably a little bit down the road. There's one point, I suppose, and I'm going to have to, I know it's probably wrapping up shortly anyway, but I do have to go on to another Zoom in about 2 minutes. Just go back to the Ming said a minute ago, about the average politician don't earn what they may or may not think. I don't actually think that's true, that that the average politician now running a million miles away from this or is diehard opposed to this. I don't think that's the case at all. I think certainly anyone that's come up in the last number of years sort of lives in the real world. I think the middle ground has shifted significantly. I think it's more the case, so to be honest, that it may not be at the top of the list for a lot of politicians. It's not that they're diametrically opposed to these things in the way that they might have been maybe 20 years ago or more. It's more that there's lots of other stuff going on, and it's not something that's engaging them. But I think people might be pleasantly surprised if they were to talk to their local representative of any party, actually. I think they'll find that there's probably a much more open door than they might think, and they might see why things happening faster because there's lots of other stuff going on, and it's probably not top of their agendas. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're screaming the murder against it, as they might have been maybe. But look, a lot of stuff was different 20 years ago, and the world has changed in a good way. So maybe just to make that point. Thanks for the discussion, Emily. Thanks for hosting it, and thanks to all the participants. And look, I've certainly taken a lot away from it, and I'll follow up on. I think was had a particular point. Happy to follow up on that, and if there's other points that come in afterwards, like I'm happy to bring those. I suppose to private ministers and government departments, and look, see if we get official answers on those as well. I've shared my own thoughts, but I think you're looking for more government, in some cases, for quite specific actions, and I'm happy to follow those up if I can. So thanks a million.
Thank you very much. That was brilliant. It's always great to hear your perspective. So last but not least, Gino, would you like to touch on Stephen's question?
Yeah, no, it's a good model. Cannabis social clubs. It's a very, it seems to be a very democratic and transparent way of, people, using cannabis in a very kind of civilized manner that's kind of regulated and so forth. So I think it's a very, very good idea. But in order for that to happen, you would think that the law would have to change. Now, people will probably do it. People will use cannabis whether the law is changed or not. So that's kind of academic. But I would like to see, as part of the legislation this year in relation to cannabis regulation, that social clubs would be part of that, and people can grow cannabis in their own home. But it's a good model. But the model I would like to see is that there's dispensaries, state dispensaries, in relation to people that want to obtain cannabis. There would be kind of a coffee shops, so forth, where people can use cannabis there and consume it and buy it, where it's regulated and controlled, and taxed and all that. And I think that's the way forward, because anything else kind of skirts around the issue. The Dáil has, the composition of the Dáil has moved on, particularly around this issue, but it's at snail's pace. Literally, at snail's pace, and we need to do something different, because if we go the pace that we're going at the moment, we'd be still here to talk about the exact same thing in 10 years' time. So something has to change, and I'm looking forward to the reaction in relation to a bill on ending prohibition, because it will put her up to political parties. What side are you on? And without being kind of partisan and divisive. But we got to break the logjam of what the present drug laws are doing, and they just don't work. So we need to kind of draw a line to say, look, we need to kind of do something different than we have been doing before. And one of the issues that I'd be quite passionate about is the issue around kind of cannabis use and the laws around cannabis use. Cannabis should be, we can have a debate about kind of the pros and cons, but cannabis should be legalized and regulated and taxed. And the way to do that is by changing the law. Once you change the law, then you can kind of, you can start, have a grown-up conversation about people that want to use cannabis, fully conversant adults. That's their choice. You can have social clubs. You can go down to the dispensary and buy a quantity of cannabis and use it. That's your business. Sure, what whose business? Who's it to anybody in society to say, look at what you're doing is illegal? It's absolutely the most ridiculous law ever created. That a plant, think about it, a plant that can grow in your house, it can grow anywhere. Somebody to tell you that it's illegal to grow it and legal to use it. It's the most ridiculous thing ever created in human history. That, you know, and it's a complete failure, absolute failure. That you can send people to prison for it, you can send people to jail for it. People are killing each other for it. You know, it's literally ludicrous. And anybody that actually supports that are part of the problem.
Thank you for that, Gino. Thank you again. So I'm very sorry. I know we had a couple more people who wanted to ask questions, but we could be here until this time tomorrow, I would say, with great confidence, and we would still not be finished talking. So we're going to close up there, and I just wanted to thank everyone who came. So first of all, the audience. It's been amazing to see such a turnout. It's been brilliant to see people engaging with politicians and engaging with each other on this topic. Really warms my heart, and I'm sure it warms the hearts of our lovely speakers too. So I wanted to say thank you, Luke, Aidan, Gino, obviously James and Colm as well, but they've gone. It was great to hear what you've had to say, and I'm sure everyone here had a great time. So I wanted to kind of touch on one thing just to close up. It's a point that's been brought up a good few times, but it's the importance of engaging with politicians. So my lovely co-conspirator Jade and I have been planning this event for a long time because it is very difficult, especially for young people, to engage with politicians, local ones, national ones, international ones, on the topics that affect them. And I think it's so important that everyone has their voices heard, and quite often there's only one demographic that make their voices heard. You know, I'm sure you all get letters from the same couple of people every week or every other week talking about what they want to fix, and more often than not it's coming from a particular background. And so we kind of held this event not only with the intention of having this talk, which was brilliant, but also with the intention of making people aware that they can reach out and they can speak to the people who represent them, and also to encourage the people that represent us to reach out to us and to speak with us. So it's been a brilliant success. I did not think it would go on this long, so I leave you off for your tea, your biscuits, whatever you want now. Normally at the end of this we'd have flowers or we'd have a gift card or something, but since it's online, I think you'll just have to accept all of our thanks.
Somebody gave Gino a cup of coffee. I saw that and I was very
Yeah. And a can of Coke.
Right.
And a can of Coke.
Oh, and a can of Coke.
Yeah.
Gino was taking Coke right through the entire meeting.
Sure, we were all drinking coffee, so I suppose we've all been using drugs for this whole thing.
Yeah.
The old days.
Thank you, Emily, for all your work. Well done.
Cookies.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and I think we're going to end it here. I hope everyone who's attended has a brilliant day, and I'm going to say goodbye.
Thanks, Emily.
Yeah,
Bye.
right.
Yeah, lads.
Thanks for attending. Thank you very much.
And guys, welcome back. What a hell of an event. I thought that was a great event. Well done to Jade, Emily and all of the rest of the committee over at the SSDP for organising it, because that was excellent, really well put together. And thanks again to the speakers, I suppose, who came and made the event possible. It was great to actually see representatives from Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael actually engaging with this policy and not just shying away from it. While I didn't agree entirely with their positions or their opinions, I'm very thankful that they came and shared them with us, because too often or not, these politicians often would avoid events like this, avoid these awkward questions. But no, I thought that was a great event and very well put together. An amazing host there as well, also throughout the whole lot. Emily, very well done. So yeah, that you see what can be achieved. That these are a bunch of students. You know, they're often discredited in media. Come Rag Week and things like this. You know, oh, so irresponsible about drink and drugs and things. But like, that was an event put together by a bunch of students under the banner of Students for Sensible Drug Policy, because we want to better our society. We want to improve things. We want to undo the harms, change policies in order to better the future. You know, because the future is us and our kids. And you know, Colin Burke there now. He's like he's quite a long, quite a long time in politics. As he kind of even said it, like some of the speakers there, he said probably weren't even born while he was out there engaging in political issues. So like he's got quite an old way of thinking coming into this, like, and you could see that like from the Fine Gael perspectives, like just towing that party line. It was great. He stayed and he listened and he shared his opinions and stuff. Like, and I really hope he goes away and thinks about what he heard there this evening. But you can see the old party line coming in there, like in a very, it's very closed minded. But I do like to think that he was listening in some capacity anyway. Like, so I hope you all enjoy that out there, guys. That event has been recorded by the UCC SSDP. So I just streamed it there kind of off the back just to try to widen the audience that it reached. I will be taking the stream down off my own platforms, and the UCC SSDP will be uploading their version of it very soon to their own platforms. So I do thank them again for holding such an event and giving me an opportunity to stream it out there to yourselves, because I think it is very important that this message gets out there far and wide. So guys, it is late in the evening. I'm going to sign off, and yeah, who's out there, guys? I see quite a lot of comments. Keith, Bitcoin is power. Who else is out there? Jenny Mack over on Twitch. John Finnegan, Jarla. Guys, pleasure just to see you all out there. Europe's Ninja, Hugh Jas. Yeah, guys, it's I see all your comments just pouring in there as well at the moment. Gabberhead says, well done, great event. Might have saved a life, and it would have been worth it just for that, Martin. So yeah, that's just some of the sentiment coming in. John Finnegan says, your numbers for the stream went into the 60s. Well done. Yeah, that's the job. I'll pass that message back to the guys at the SSDP, because yeah, I'm sure that they were blown away by just the audience they had on the Microsoft Teams, plus an extended audience there then outside on YouTube, Facebook and Twitch. So it's great. So yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in. I hope you all enjoyed it. I'll be back, don't forget, on Wednesday with some more 420 news. Tomorrow I do have an interview lined up with Albert Tio. Go out and check out Albert Tio if you haven't ever heard of that name before. A very prominent activist in the Spanish scene around cannabis social clubs. I'll be recording that one. I won't be doing it live at all, unfortunately, so apologies for that, but I will be releasing it as soon as I get it done. I'll process it and I'll get it out as soon as possible, because I think it is a time-sensitive one. Albertio's currently in prison at the moment, albeit an open prison, still in prison. So he will be telling me all about that, all about his adventures as a cannabis activist, the whole journey through being involved with all of the cannabis associations and cannabis clubs over there in Spain. So I really do look forward to that and getting it out there to you again, guys. So guys, have a nice evening. I see you on Wednesday, so stay blazed, guys, and keep her lit. Much love.
Knowing anything about quality is already